Hello, today is Tuesday, June 20th, 2023. I'm Sara Crifasi, and this is Staying Connected. If your enterprise is still using TDM voice services such as PRIs, POTS lines, or T1 access circuits, you're likely feeling a strong push, if not a shove, from your carrier to transition off of those legacy connections and toward next generation services. This may mean that you'll have to start sourcing and evaluating new solutions to replace those analog services on a more expedited time frame than your business would have preferred. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Jack Deal, a managing director at TC2, and Mark Sheard, a managing director at TC2 UK, to talk about the challenges enterprises are facing when confronted with what's essentially a forcible transition away from legacy services, and to go over what enterprise customers should consider when planning for disconnections and migrations. Jack and Mark, thanks so much for joining me today. So, TDM voice is going away. Can you give us more on the background here?
Yes. Hi, Sarah. It's Mark here. I will give you some background. Actually, a lot of this stemmed from the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC as it's better known, loosening its regulations on the discontinuance of TDM services. And this was beginning back in August the 2nd, 22. And what this has done is give carriers much more flexibility, i.e. control, over when they decommission legacy infrastructure, as well as allowing them to give reduced notice timeframes. Our LB3 attorney colleagues, of which you are one, of course, will advise that there are still some exceptions about how TDM can be pulled, and customers still have some rights to file against announced discontinuances. But frankly, the process can be complicated and the reasons to argue against discontinuance very limited. In practice, carriers may not actually discontinue the service entirely, but by making things cost prohibitive, they might just price it out of reach of customers and force a migration to alternate services. The FCC itself has largely deregulated its control over such pricing, although the states can have different regulations, of course. But the practical effect is the same. So over a longer period, it's driving people to migrate away from TDM services. Now, this has also been a long time coming, and customers actually have been given a lot of warning about it. But still, many enterprises haven't properly considered the move requirements until they are now facing large price increases. And as you know, Jack and I have been talking about the demise of TDM, time division multiplexing services, for the past several years. Originally, the more pressing requirements are migration away from data networking services. And then with our podcast in 2022, The TDM Pain is Real, the previous Staying Connected host, Joe Schmidt, your predecessor, accurately called out in the message that enterprises were quite literally paying the price for staying on TDM.
Jack, could you give us a quick summary of what you said last year to put this in further context?
Thanks, Sarah. And sure, nice to be with you today. Last year, we called out a variety of things that were going to be bad for the enterprise, and these all still apply. Across all suppliers, we're seeing huge TDM price increases, often of 50 to 60% or even 100% and more. Enterprises were being actively encouraged to migrate away from TDM services, and hardline contract positions on the services were being taken by the suppliers. Renewals coming in with reduced or eliminated service levels, and changes or additions to current TDM services constrained or simply not allowed. Receiving heads-up notices for the services to be grandfathered, and an immediate need to consider your TDM transition strategies if you didn't want to be badly exposed. Unfortunately, we see numerous examples of where that consideration hasn't come early enough. And finally, a bunch of unexpected disruption and effort.
Mark, is there anything that you'd add to that list to bring us up to date?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. From Jack's summary, the first thing I'd say is all of the above are still true, but the situation is now worse and even more pressing. Unfortunately, it's a truism, but the clock has run down. So if I was to give a quick update on some of the key elements that are happening now, is first would be in terms of price increases. These have been even more concerning, and it's true that they're getting bill shock attention from executives within enterprises. Often price jumps are being immediately applied. And in fact, in a recent deal, we've seen a 500% price hike on TDM voice charges. We're also seeing with several suppliers that they're confirming their intent to completely cease services in 23 and 24, which is potentially leaving enterprises high and dry. Further, another thing we've seen with some suppliers is that they're actually making it difficult to disconnect from some of these services, even when you want to. Here, one very relevant and present example is we're seeing dedicated voice T1s associated with toll-free numbers which use advanced routing features. So that could be things like routing by originating area code or exchange or time of day or day of week routing. So in this case, now we're seeing that before a customer is allowed to terminate the service, the customer has to actually go in and disconnect and remove some of those features using a software program. This is not straightforward. And it also then relies on the supplier coming back and taking action that can take several months to progress. All the while, if you think about it, the customer is continuing to pay those recently inflated charges for services that it isn't using. In fact, this specific problem will be the subject of a future TC2 podcast from our expert in this area, Julie Gardner. One other thing we're seeing is that overall enterprises have run out of time to implement alternatives in a structured way and are being forced to make rushed solution and supplier selection decisions, even for the bulk move of their more standard voice service needs. And at the same time, you might expect this, but some executives are turning around to the telecoms team or the network or the sourcing team and asking, how could you have let this happen? And sometimes also kicking off knee-jerk reactions, more of the rush solution, rush supplier selection decisions as part of recovery plans. And such catch-up strategies are leaving enterprises exposed to inflated TDM charges to keep things together while they transition, higher costs arising from rushing at new solution alternatives, very much suboptimal commercial flexibility, solution capability, and support arrangements, and further gaps in the legacy capability or service coverage with the new solution, which might not provide the same capabilities that you're enjoying with TDM today. The sourcing and networking teams are actually being overwhelmed, we're seeing at many customers, with the urgency and the scale and the complexity of the task that's actually facing them. And more than ever, it's clear that third-party expert advisor support is indispensable to drive supplier selection and service transformation forward. And this can be whether it's optimizing the strategy in the face of the challenges, executing on the sourcing and implementation effort, which, by the way, is often underestimated in terms of the effort to do it and the time to undertake things like data gathering and number porting. And another area that support or that third-party support could also provide is undertaking that important gap analysis to make sure those services that don't fit the standard part of a new solution are cared for in wherever you move to from your TDM services.
So what should an enterprise do if it still needs some of those other services currently provided via TDM voice, but it faces those services being taken away or becoming prohibitively expensive?
Great point, Sarah. This could be for uses like elevator lines, security systems, fire alarms, and fax machines. The good news is that there are some alternatives when PRI or POTS line signaling is still required. Now, usually these alternatives operate over dedicated internet access, business broadband, or cellular connectivity. They involve some form of hardware with a battery backup, and they're most typically sold as a managed services. These could be particularly useful to address fears of not being able to transition elements of services currently enjoyed to mainstream alternative solutions for enterprise voice, such as centralized SIP or Teams enterprise voice. In reviewing the potential use of such POTS replacement services, it will be important for enterprises to understand how their utility scales in terms of cost and complexity, but as a complement to a wider voice strategy, they undoubtedly deserve some consideration.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you too, Mark. So there's a lot to take in here on an expedited time frame. And if a migration off of legacy voice services is on the horizon for your company, you can reach out to Mark or Jack directly. And if you have any other questions regarding the transition from TDM voice services toward alternative or next generation offerings, or if you'd like to discuss your other ICT needs with Jack, Mark, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, don't hesitate to give any one of us a call or shoot us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and following us on LinkedIn.